Good morning. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm David Barnett, brand protection strategist at Stobbs. We're an IP management and brand protections provider. I'm going to be talking about domain name use in brand infringements and fraud. I think I've prepared slightly more content than I've technically got time for, so I'll probably go through some parts a bit quickly, although I think the session after this is not happening, so I may extend slightly. But as ever, if you've got any questions or you'd like me to go over everything in any more detail, please do reach out later in the event. So my presentation is going to be divided into two main parts. The first part is going to be a series of case studies looking at domain name use in infringements. And the second part, part 3 here, is going to be looking at how we can get insights from domain data to use in threat scoring and prioritization as part of the brand protection analysis that we do. So first of all, I just want to start with some definitions, really. So when I talk about brand protection, really what I'm talking about is a combination of monitoring and discovery. So that's the process of finding infringing or brand relevant content, followed by a series of analysis processes, which is where we prioritize the results we find. And then that leads on to the third part, which is enforcement or takedown of infringing content. When we're looking at brand protection, brand monitoring, we're really looking to identify a range of different infringement types, and that will include things like counterfeiting, fraud and phishing, piracy, and a whole range of other brand issues, which will include things like traffic misdirection, negative brand association, kind of the various types of fake sites that you'll be familiar with. And really, when we're doing brand monitoring, brand protection, we're looking to cover a range of online channels. So domain names, general internet content, social media, mobile apps, and so on. But obviously here, I'm going to be talking mainly about domain names. And there's, apart from the fact that this is the Domain Summit, there's a good reason really to concentrate on domain names. And that's that they really hold a central position of importance in brand protection. When I talk about branded domain names, what I'm talking about here is instances where the name of the brand being infringed is present within the name of the domain name, which is being used by the infringer. The reason why branded domain names are so important is that when compared with a similar infringement, which maybe isn't using a branded domain names generally have high search engine ranking, so high visibility to potential customers. They constitute a more explicit type of intellectual property abuse. Generally, there's more enforcement options open to take down a branded domain name than for other types of equivalent content. And obviously, domain names are quite versatile in the hands of an infringer. They can be used not just for building a website, but they can be used, for example, for just sending emails, using the email functionality, and so on. Couple more ideas to just kind of throw out there just before we kind of get started into the detail. One other thing to note about domain names is that from a brand protection, a brand monitoring point of view, they're relatively easy to find, and the kind of level of detection that you can have with domain name monitoring can be fairly comprehensive. And that's because we use a range of different data types. We will use zone file from the various registries and other techniques to sort of fill in the gaps in data. And obviously, it's really important that we're able to find as many of these relevant domain names as possible, given kind of their versatility from a fraud and infringement point of view. The other point to note about domain names is they come with them a rich associated data set. So in general, every domain name will have a whois record. They're obviously a lot more redacted these days since the introduction of various privacy regulations. But in general, you'll get information about a domain name concerning who it's owned by, the registrant, who it's registered through, the registrar, when it was registered, and so on. Generally, we can find various pieces of hosting information. So things like the IP address where a domain name is hosted, the provider who's operating that IP address, the country where a website is hosted, and so on. And again, there are different reasons why certain providers, certain countries are more attractive to infringers than others. And we'll touch on that a little bit later. We can look at a domain name to see if there's an MX record associated with the domain name. That will tell you whether there's a potential that the domain is being used for its email functionality. We can look at things like web traffic. So obviously, all things being equal, a more popular, a more highly trafficked domain will be of greater significance than one with less traffic. And really, one of the sort of things to take away from this is that all of this data is really useful when it comes to prioritizing the set of domains that we've detected, working out which ones are the ones most worthy of attention. And obviously, it's really important that we're able to do that given the sort of level of significance of domain names in brand protection, as I've mentioned. So now I'm going to sort of step into the first main part of the presentation, which is a series of case studies illustrating how domain names can be used in the creation of deceptive content. Again, a couple of ideas to think about here. The first thing to sort of bear in mind is that many brand infringements will involve brand impersonation in some way. And obviously, if you're an infringer, one of the things that's really important to get right is to create the appearance of authenticity, make it look like you're the brand that you're impersonating. And obviously, the use of a branded domain name is a really compelling way of being able to do that. Also worth bearing in mind that really anyone can register any domain name, so there's that ease of availability to infringers. It's also worth noting that as well as just using domain names that contain the brand name being impersonated, it's quite often a popular approach is to use some sort of brand variant, like a typo, a homoglyph, which is a character substitution, and so on. And again, there's various reasons why that can be quite attractive. Firstly, it makes the domain names more likely to be available to register in the first place. It might make them more difficult to detect by the brand owner or a brand protection service provider like the ones I worked for. It may mean that the enforcement options are more limited, and it may be a source of being able to attract web traffic, which maybe you wouldn't be able to get through other routes. So, for example, being able to attract traffic from mistyped sort of web address typing requests. Okay, so firstly, I'm going to now step into the series of case studies. So the first one is looking at the use of brand variants in domain names. So this is a study which was done in 2022. And what we were doing in this case was to take a look at the top 10 most valuable global brands at that time. So that was people like Google, Amazon, and so on. And then looking for what domains were out there that were registered, either containing those brand names or some sort of fuzzy match to the brand name. So a sort of deceptive typo or a character substitution. Again, I won't go through all the detail, but really the key things to take away is that when we did this analysis, we found a data set of about 8,500 domain names that were relevant to what we were looking at. And less than 1% of those were actually registered to the brand owner in question. So that's suggesting there was a big gap in sort of defensive registrations, leaving loads of these domain names open for third parties to register and abuse. Some of the domains contain these homoglyphs that I was talking about. So that's where you replace a character in the brand name with maybe a non-Latin character that looks similar. We found various other types of kind of misspellings. So transposed domains, so that's where a pair of characters is swapped. So that's the sort of thing that could attract traffic from mistyped web browser queries. And about a third of the domains actually had active MX records. So that's mail exchange records. So what that's telling us is that all of those domains have the potential to be used for their email functionality. So potentially for doing things like sending phishing emails. There's just an illustration here of the types of variations we were seeing. So 3 tables of like top 10 variation types that we were seeing. So on the left here, we've got the types of misspellings that we were seeing for the various brands in question. So Google, Apple, Microsoft, and so on. And then the other 2 tables are showing us the types of character substitutions that we were seeing in those domain names. So we've got the middle table is showing Latin character for Latin character replacements. The right-hand table is showing Latin character for other character replacements. And really, you can see there's a few patterns in there. There's quite a lot of use of the replacement of a character with one that looks visually similar, as you'd expect. So replacing an O with a 0 or an O with an accented O. And we do also see some sort of adjacent keyboard substitutions as well. So I think G and D, I think, are next to each other on a keyboard. So again, they're the sorts of things that could attract mistyped traffic. What are these domains being used for? Well, predictably, they are being used, a lot of them, for infringements. So these are 4 examples of kind of domain names that we found in this study containing mistyped or brand variants of the brands we were looking at. So you can see 1, 2, 3, 4 mistypes of Google, McDonald's, Amazon, and Google again. And you can see here the types of content that we were seeing. So this first one is a lookalike site. Looks very much like Google, but it isn't Google. So potentially is being there to collect login details, maybe send you to sort of unauthorized content. The second one was purporting to be the McDonald's kind of customer loyalty club. Again, not official and probably just there to collect login details. This is a different type of brand infringement. The Amazon one actually misspelled as Amazon. So again, you can see they were using a sort of similar style of logo to Amazon, but actually this site was selling firearms. So sort of illegal activity, which kind of generates a negative brand association. The final example is a misspelling of Google, but actually resolves to a sort of competitor search engine site. So that's a kind of instance of where they're using the brand name to try and draw traffic to a competitor site. The second case study is looking at what I've termed hyphenated domain name infringements. And this came out of an SMS-based scam that we became aware of. I've mocked it up here on the right-hand side using not the original brand that was targeted, but just a sort of anonymized brand name, which we've turned Finance Brand. Their official website would have been financebrand.com. And you can see here that what the link that you find in that text message scam looks like it's a financebrand.com link. It looks like it's just been split across a line break. Actually, what's happened here is they registered financebrand-d.com. So the hyphen is actually part of the domain name, but they're relying on people reading this in an SMS browser. These browsers have a tendency to split words across a line break and add a hyphen. And obviously they're hoping that users will just assume that's what they're looking at. And actually that sort of leads to quite a convincing way of doing a deceptive scan. So we were interested to sort of see how prevalent is this type of infringement. So again, we looked at the top 10 most valuable brand names, and we looked at the hyphenated versions of them, putting a hyphen in each position in each of those brand names to see which of those domains were registered and could potentially be used in this type of scam. So this is kind of a subset of the type of fuzzy matchy typos that we were looking at in the previous case study. And again, you see sort of some similar things. Of the sort of 140 domains that we found that were registered, only 10% of those were registered defensively by the brand owner. All of the rest were in the hands of third parties and potentially could be used for abuse. And then hopefully I'm not standing too much in the way of this, but really the other thing we're saying is that of the domains that we did find that were registered to third party, there were significant other indicators on them that they could be used for fraud. Several of them were had associated MX records, so potentially were being used to send emails. One of the associated websites generated one of these browser warnings that deceptive content had already been identified and been flagged up to the browser. And some of the ones that did resolve to live content, there was content of concern in some cases, login pages, and so on. The next case study is a similar idea. This is a type of infringement called a bit squat, and this relies on the idea that sometimes when a domain name is in transit, so from browser request out to the sort of DNS request, sometimes that request can be corrupted, and one of the characters in the domain name can have one of its bits flipped from a 1 to a 0. And what that does, when it's translated back into Latin characters, it means you get a domain name which isn't exactly the same as the one you were looking for. So example here, for Pinterest, you get Pinterest. So the R and the S differ in their binary representations by just one character. Now, normally that wouldn't matter. If your browser request gets corrupted, you just don't get to a live site. But if someone is clever enough to register that variant and point it at, in this case, a lookalike site, they can collect traffic that was intended for the brand owner in question. So again, this was another study sort of looking at similar things. Again, we looked at about 1,500 domain names that could be used in this way. And again, about 10% of them only were registered to the brand owner. The rest were potentially being used for abuse. And again, we did find various live examples. As the Pinterest one was probably the most compelling one because it did actually resolve to a lookalike site, but we did find various other examples of third-party content that potentially is going to be of concern to the brand owner being targeted. So this next one is a way of that's quite often used by infringers to create a domain name, a URL that appears similar to a legitimate URL. So normally, if you were to go to google.com, the thing that might come up in your address bar is www.google.com, but someone might register www-google.com, including that www in the domain name itself, as again, quite a kind of compelling way of creating a deceptive URL. So here we looked at two different types of infringements, one where www appears at the start of the domain name, one where HTTP appears at the start of the domain name, again, to see whether these were out there and whether they were potentially being used for abuse. When we ran that study, again, the next slide shows us the top strings that we found in those domain names. So you can see there's lots of different brands being targeted here, Apple, Google, misspelling of iCloud, Roblox, and so on. And again, these are all potentially could be used to create sort of deceptive URLs targeting the brands in question. We ran a similar look at domains targeting that same list of top 10 brands. And again, you can see that certainly for the www domains, in some cases, there were hundreds of these domains out there kind of being ripe for abuse. Again, as I've mentioned in the previous case studies, there are in many cases additional indications of active infringing use. You can see here some additional red flags that various of the domain names here contained other kind of suspicious keywords, which we often find associated with phishing, so support, login, and so on. And again, lots of these domains had active MX records, so potentially are being used for sending emails. So the next kind of is a slight variation on the theme again. So we talked about the hyphenated variants. Another way that you can create a deceptive URL that appears, in this case, similar to Google, is to actually register a truncated part of that domain name and then append a subdomain name separated from it by a dot. So all of these are different host names that resemble google.com, but none of them are on the google.com domain. This one is on oogle.com. This one is on ogle.com. Obviously, lots of these are already taken, but if you can find a truncated variant which is available for registration, once you've got that domain, you can kind of tack on the front of it any subdomain you like. And again, it can be a really compelling way of creating a deceptive URL. Again, similar story. We looked at these various variants that were out there, looked at how they were being used. Lots of them did point at active sites, so they had active A records. Lots of them had active MX records, so potentially were being used for email functionality. And again, only a very small proportion were registered sort of defensively by the brand owner in question. Sort of looking into that in a little bit more detail, we found that there were various examples amongst that data set where they were being used to drive traffic to either deceptive or third-party content. Some of the porn sites in this data set, the variants of those were being used to drive traffic to competitor porn sites. So it's a slightly odd situation where we're actually looking at brand infringements against these types of sites. But again, we saw things like google.com, redirection of traffic to third-party content that's nothing to do with Google, in this case, promoting a VPN product, and so on. The graph on the right is just trying to get a little bit of a sort of insight into maybe how these patterns have changed over time. So what we've got here is a plot. Along the horizontal axis, we've got the length of the domain name that could be used in this way. And along the vertical axis, we've got when that domain was registered. So with the oldest domains at the bottom going right back to the 1980s in some cases. Really what we're seeing here is that for the shortest domains, a lot of those were registered a long time ago. And that's really not surprising. These will have been domains that were registered in many cases for completely unrelated purposes. But when we start looking at the longer domain names, which feature a truncated variant of a brand name, so these are the ones that are potentially more likely to be used for this type of infringement. Actually, what we find is that a lot of those were registered more recently. So we're seeing some indication that maybe this type of infringement attack route is something which is starting to gain popularity with infringers, and again is something for brand owners to keep an eye on. So this is another sort of related type of infringement. So it bears some relation to the sort of the first SMS-based scam I showed you. So this one here, this was like a phishing attack against HSBC Bank. And you can see here that the link at the bottom, if you look at it without really knowing what you're looking at, that looks like an hsbc.co.uk link, which is obviously their legitimate UK site. But actually, the domain name that's being used to launch that attack is uk-account.help. It's nothing to do with HSBC. And again, they've created a subdomain, in this case using HSBC, to build that deceptive link. And they've relied on the fact that in many cases, the browser will truncate that link at the hyphen and again, make it look even more convincing. So in this case, what we did is we had a look at whether there are various other UK hyphen domain names that could be used in this way with keywords after the UK that maybe could relate to a subject area that might be associated with infringements. And you can see we found lots of potential candidate examples, tax, insurance claims, and so on. Another thing to sort of think about with these is that they can be very attractive from an infringer's point of view, because they're very difficult to detect if you're just looking at the domain name registration itself, because by definition, the domain name itself, in this case, ukaccount.help, has no brand reference in it. So you don't know what you're looking for if you're looking for the registration of these domains. So again, it's very attractive from an infringer's point of view. The only way of really finding this attack, unless you can intercept the SMS itself, is to actually know to look for all of the subdomains that have been configured on the domain in question. We did a similar thing for com-domains, which, as you can imagine, can be used in lots of different ways. But in this case, we took it a step further and we actually ran a series of searches to actually see what subdomains had been configured on these domains and whether any of them were being used in this kind of way. And you can see, so at the top right here, there's 3 examples of some of the infringing subdomains that we found. So you can see top to bottom, impersonating websites like CNN.com, pay.com, and so on. And in some cases, these were being pointed at third-party infringing or competitor content. So now sort of moving on to the second, slightly shorter, you'll be pleased to know, main part of the presentation. So this is looking at how we can use this data, it's sort of insights from the infringement patterns in domain analysis and threat scoring. So really what I'm talking about here is the fact that, as I mentioned at the beginning, domain names themselves have a wide range of features associated with them. And even if there's no website configured, those features, the TLD and so on, can provide insights. And there's a couple of main areas that's useful. First of all, in clustering results together. So if you can find several otherwise apparently unrelated domains that share distinctive characteristics in common, then you can build, an assertion that those domains are connected to each other, and that can be really helpful to identify things like high volume infringers, give you the possibility to do takedowns in bulk, demonstrate that the owners of the websites are operating in bad faith if they're doing lots of this type of stuff, and so on. The other area where this type of data is useful is in assessing the level of potential threat that a newly identified domain registration might pose. And that's really what I want to talk about here. Really, when the sort of rationale behind this is when you find a domain, generally when you're doing domain monitoring, you might find hundreds or thousands of domain registrations, and you want to work out which are the ones that you should be worrying about first, which are the ones you might need to take enforcement action against, and actually looking at things like infringement patterns, which can help you inform your defensive registration policy going forwards. So here on this slide, there's a series of examples of the features associated with a domain that you can use in this way. So things like the TLD, the domain name extension, which I'll come back to in a minute. Things like features of the registrant details. Now, as I said, these days, in many cases, most of this information is redacted. But again, if you can see that what appears to be a company website is registered using a Gmail address or a Yahoo address, that's not something that is likely to often be the case for a legitimate corporate site. So that can be a red flag in itself. Looking at features like where the website is hosted. So as I've mentioned before, certain countries are more popular with infringers if, for example, there are areas where there's poor regulations that help with enforcement or taking these websites down. Similarly, with registrars, some registrars are more or less compliant with enforcement requests. Obviously, looking at the brand match type, so whether there's a brand reference in the domain name versus a typo or some sort of other variant, which we've seen can be associated with infringing activity. MX records traffics, we've talked about. SSL certificates. So SSL certificate is a feature of a website that allows it to have a secure HTTPS connection. Now, in the past, that was always kind of flagged up as an indicator that a website was legitimate. But actually, it's no longer really an effective indicator of trust, because free or budget providers, where there's no real verification of legitimacy, allow infringers to buy SSL certificates very easily. And actually, there was a recent study by the Anti-Phishing Working Group which showed that actually 80% of phishing sites utilize SSLs. So again, but who that provider is can be an indicator of whether or not it's likely to be trustworthy or not. Domain name entry is a mathematical characteristic of a domain name, which I'll come back to in a minute, which can kind of give you some insights as well. So now I just want to step through a couple of slides looking at a little bit more detail on some of these individual features. Can we step forward? Sorry. Bear with me. Uh-oh. That's right. Seems to be working. Let me. Thank you. So this is from a study looking at the prevalence of domains associated with various types of infringement. In this case, phishing, spam, and malware themselves taken from a series of earlier studies, really looking at how frequently each TLD is used for infringing purposes. Important thing to say here is that this is actually looking at the rate of association with malicious activity rather than the absolute numbers. If we just looked at the absolute numbers, .com would be top purely by virtue of the fact that there are far, far more .com domains out there than anything else. So in this case, what we do is we normalize data by the total number of domains on that extension to sort of see which are the ones that are higher risk. And you can see that there are, some domains here, some top level domains here that are sort of a bit notorious for having deceptive content associated with them. A lot of the top country code domains tend to be in regions such as Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, and that is caused by a number of factors, including typically the cost of registration in these countries, the fact that often there are lax security registration policies, the fact that in many of these countries there's poorly developed enforcement processes, and actually the wealth of a country can have some impact on the level of expertise within the ISPs themselves, and can mean that some countries are more attractive to infringers. The second characteristic I just want to touch on is this thing, domain name entropy. I won't go into the maths here. I'm sure you'll be pleased to know. But basically what domain name entropy is quantifying how long and random a domain name is. So a very long domain name consisting of lots of random characters will have high entropy, essentially. And those types of domain names are very frequently associated with automated registrations used by infringers in bulk to create large numbers of fake sites. So again, sort of domain name entropy can be used as a proxy as to sort of how likely a domain name is to be used for sort of nefarious purposes. Digging into that in a little bit more detail. Now, this is quite busy. I won't go into it in too much more detail, but this is a plot of the mean domain name entropy across a series of domain name extensions, TLDs, and the threat score from my previous study. And again, it's pretty noisy. But there is some suggestion that the domains at the high entropy end of the scale tend in general to be higher risk. So again, gives you some indication that this is a viable characteristic to use for threat scoring. I'll step through these a bit more quickly now because I'm aware of time. So this is looking at IP addresses where domains are hosted. So what we did here was we had a database of around 169,000 IP addresses, which had been whitelisted. We chunked them up into what I've termed second level net blocks. So these are IPv4 IP addresses of the form a.b.x.x. And what we've done is we've taken those IP addresses and we've plotted them on this square plot. The A is going along the horizontal axis, B is going down the vertical axis. And so what we can see is hotspots where there are particular net blocks where there tend to be more blacklisted IP addresses, maybe sort of high risk net blocks that are popular with infringers again. So really, this is kind of looking at the sort of hotspots of activity. If we take it down one more level and look at third level blocks, so A.B.C.X, we find that there's a top list. So each of these blocks consists of 256 possible addresses. And that we can see for these top blocks, almost every single IP address in that block, and in this case, absolutely every single one, has been blacklisted for infringing activity. So again, this type of idea is really key, that if you find another domain, another website that's hosted at the same IP address, you can be pretty reasonably expected to take a very close look at it, because it's going to be highly likely also to be used for some sort of nefarious purposes. Step on from the IP address itself to see who the underlying provider is and where that IP address is based. And these are the top 10s in each case. I think it's 10. Now, obviously, in this case, this data is not normalized. And what we're not saying here is that every domain hosted by Amazon is dodgy. The reason they've got so many blacklisted IP addresses is because they simply have so many IP addresses under management. So going forward, we would probably want to normalize this by the total number of IP addresses under management. But you can see here that we start to get the framework of a possible threat scoring system using these types of features. Having geo-localized all of those IP addresses, we can visualize the data in a different way, looking at where geographically these high-risk IP addresses are. Again, this data has not been normalized, so a lot of this will reflect just where IP addresses tend to be hosted, where the data centers are. But you can see that we do start to see hotspots in some of the places that we know are kind of hotspots of infringing activity, so hosting in India, Southeast Asia, and so on. So that's the main part. In terms of takeaways, so really, I guess the main things to take away is obviously domain names have this key central role in brand protection considerations because they can comprise some of the highest concern, highest relevant findings, but also because they have these inherent features associated with them, which can be used to gain insights into infringement patterns and then help us develop these threat scoring algorithms, which we can use to prioritize results. In many cases, the reason domain name abuse is key is because it's used in the creation of content which is actively deceptive by infringers, and various ways to do that, including the use of typos, homoglyphs, and so on, as we've seen. There's also various options for other ways of creating deceptive URLs, such as the www, HTTP ones, the host name-based infringements, the hyphenated domain names, and so on. But also the other thing to take away is really we can use insights from these types of analysis in clustering and in threat scoring. And that helps us obviously work out which of the domains out of a data set are the ones we should look at in more detail. So does it work? It does. Unsurprisingly, otherwise I wouldn't be talking about it. This is a very, very simple idea of a sort of very rudimentary threat scoring algorithm. So what we did here was we did a simple look at just a set of 10% of one day's worth of .com registrations, about 11,000 domains in the data set. And we used the insights from things like the blacklisted IP addresses and also some of the other factors I've talked about, so the high-risk registrars, hosting locations, and so on, to build a sort of rudimentary threat score based, which we apply to that set of domain names and see if the ones that float to top tend really, genuinely, actually to be higher risk. So we did that. We looked at the top 20, and actually, unsurprisingly, the top 20 domains ranked by this very rudimentary threat score do contain a number of examples that we would genuinely want to take a close eye at and potentially launch enforcement action against. 2 of those 20 generated browser warnings of dangerous content. Several showed some indications that actually the site we were seeing was a geo-blocked cover for different infringing content underneath. Some were explicitly phishing, soliciting for the input of details, or relating to other types of kind of online content, which is often associated with scams. So things like cryptocurrency. That's it. There's various references here if you want to delve into any of those case studies in any more detail. Obviously, as I say, if you want to discuss anything with me, please do. I assume these slides will be circulated as well. So if you want this list of references, you should be able to get that. This is me. If you wanted to reach out and discuss anything further, various of the things I've talked about are discussed in more detail in one of my 2 books at the bottom there. So do take a look if you're interested, and then grab me during the rest of the event or elsewhere online subsequently if you want to discuss anything else. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave. I actually have a question myself. So if you could give one piece of advice to a growing or upcoming business on brand protection, what would you tell them?
I think the key is really to make sure that if you're looking to launch a new brand, it's really careful to make sure you pick your brand name carefully. You need to do that to be able to secure, the domain name you want, secure the right IP protection. But you also want to pick a brand name that's not so common it's really, really difficult to monitor for, and it's really, really difficult to find the infringements against your brand within the noise. Having done that, there's obviously a certain element of defensive registrations you would want to make sure that anything which obviously could be used for infringement ideally is in your hands rather than someone else's. But obviously you can't register every possible permutation. So I think the other takeaway is once you've done all of that, just make sure you're really proactive about monitoring new content as it arises and try and get on top of it before any damage is done. Cool.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? No. Thank you very much.
Today, Mariah, so grab me. Yeah. Feel free to grab me, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, David.